The rain didn't just fall, it hammered against the skylight of my home office with the rhythmic insistence of a creditor at the door. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the one Nola bought me for my 37th because she said my posture was collapsing under the weight of my own cynicism. I adjusted the lumbar support, staring at the blueprints for the new municipal bridge spread across my mahogany desk. Precision is my life. As a civil engineer, I understand that if a single bolt is torqued incorrectly, the entire structure eventually humbles itself before gravity. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My phone vibrated. It was a sharp, aggressive buzz against the wood. I expected a notification from the site foreman about the concrete pour, or perhaps a dry remark from Liam about our upcoming Saturday golf game. Instead, the screen illuminated with a message from a number I hadn't saved but knew by heart. Monroe Drevan. "She's with me at the Heights tonight, Rhett. Don't wait up. Some people are just built for higher altitudes." I didn't drop the phone. I didn't gasp. I simply looked at the pixels until they blurred into a jagged neon smear. Sarcasm is often a shield for the small-minded, but in that moment, it was the only thing keeping my composure intact. I thought about the bridge I was designing. I thought about load-bearing capacities. Nola was currently testing the structural integrity of a decade of marriage, and the sensors were screaming. I stood up and walked to the window. The suburban street was a collection of gray shadows and glowing porch lights. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where people paid a premium for the illusion of safety and the privilege of watching their neighbors' hedges. I looked at the empty spot in the driveway where Nola's crossover usually sat. She had told me she was at a PR gala in the city, something about a luxury brand launch. The Heights, Monroe mentioned, was a boutique hotel 4 miles from my office, famous for its overpriced cocktails and its view of the river. I went back to my desk and opened the bottom drawer. It wasn't filled with files. It was filled with the quiet, methodical collection of a man who had suspected the foundations were rotting for months. I pulled out a manila folder. Inside were the receipts she thought she'd hidden in the lining of her old gym bag, a jewelry appraisal for a tennis bracelet I had never seen, a credit card statement showing 3 consecutive weekends at a spa that didn't exist. There was also a thumb drive containing the data I'd pulled from the cloud, messages that read like a manual on how to disregard a human being. Meticulous, she'd called me once, with a laugh that sounded like silver bells. She meant it as a compliment then. Now it was a threat. I grabbed my jacket and the keys to my sedan. I wasn't going to the hotel to make a scene. That was for men who believed in the efficacy of shouting. I was an engineer. I believed in the efficacy of removal. I walked through the house, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph, every artisan rug was a component of a life I no longer recognized. I paused at the hall table and looked at a photo of us from 2 years ago in Tuscany. Nola was radiant, her hand resting on my shoulder. Monroe was in the background of that very photo, a family friend holding a glass of wine and smiling at the camera with an arrogance I had mistaken for confidence. The rain was a deluge when I stepped outside. I climbed into my car, the engine turning over with a low, steady thrum. My heart was racing, a physical drumming in my chest that felt like a localized earthquake, but my hands remained steady on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. I shifted into reverse and backed out of the driveway, the tires splashing through the standing water. I needed one final piece of physical evidence, something Monroe couldn't lie his way out of, something that would strip away the veneer of his investment broker persona. I navigated the slick streets with a focused intensity. The city at night was a grid of red and white lights, a complex system I knew how to manipulate. I took the back routes, avoiding the main arteries where traffic cameras and congestion would slow me down. As I approached the downtown district, I saw Monroe's silver European coupe. It was parked illegally in a loading zone 3 blocks from the hotel entrance. He always was a man who felt the rules of the road were mere suggestions for the less fortunate. I pulled over half a block away, my lights dimmed. The rain obscured the windshield, but I saw them. They emerged from the side entrance of a high-end bistro adjacent to the hotel. Nola was laughing, her head tilted back, leaning into Monroe's side as he held a large black umbrella over them. He looked every bit the smooth, successful predator he imagined himself to be. He adjusted his coat, his movements fluid and practiced. I reached for my camera, the one with the high shutter speed and the telephoto lens I use for inspecting bridge trusses. Click, Nola's face, illuminated by a street lamp. Click, Monroe's hand on the small of her back. Click, the two of them stepping into his car, the silver door closing with a heavy, expensive thud. I didn't feel the urge to roar or strike out. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. They were moving now, the silver coupe pulling away from the curb with a chirp of tires. I followed. I kept 2 cars between us, navigating the narrow one-way streets of the warehouse district. This was the chase, a silent, high-stakes pursuit through a labyrinth of brick and asphalt. Monroe was a fast driver, reckless even in the rain. He took a sharp turn onto 4th Street, his back end sliding slightly on the wet cobblestones. I mirrored the movement, my sedan gripping the road with the precision I'd maintained through regular servicing. We were moving through the heart of the city now, the neon signs reflecting off the puddles in a kaleidoscope of commercialism. He tried to beat a yellow light at the intersection of Grand and Vine. I pressed the accelerator, the engine growling as I surged forward, narrowly clearing the crossing before the light turned a defiant red. My pulse was a steady rhythm in my ears. I wasn't just following them, I was documenting the trajectory of their downfall. They pulled into the underground parking garage of an apartment complex Monroe owned, a secondary property he used for clients. I pulled into a shadowed alcove across the street and watched the gate roll down. I sat there for a long time, the wipers sweeping back and forth, clearing the glass only for it to be blurred again a second later. The sarcasm returned then, a dry commentary in the back of my mind. Good job, Rhett. You've confirmed that the sky is blue and the people you trusted are made of cardboard. I drove back to the house in the middle of night. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the clouds breaking to reveal a moon that looked like a pale, disinterested eye. The house felt different when I walked back inside. Not like a home, but like a site awaiting demolition. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. I knew every inch of this space. I went to the master suite. Her scent, something floral and expensive, lingered in the air. I opened the closet. It was a cathedral of silk, leather, and designer labels. I ignored it all and went to my side. I grabbed my heavy duffel bags from the top shelf. I began to pack, not everything, just the things that mattered. My grandfather's watch, my engineering journals, my hard drives, the physical remnants of a man who had built things to last. I worked with a silent, ruthless efficiency. I didn't toss things, I folded them. I didn't scramble, I executed. Every item removed was a weight lifted from the structure. By 3 a.m., the house was a shell of its former self. I walked to the kitchen and looked at the granite island where we had shared coffee every morning for 3,000 days. I took a small silver key from my pocket, the key to the safety deposit box that held the deeds and the shared bonds. I placed it in the center of the island. Next to it, I laid out the photos I had taken an hour ago, still damp from the printer in my office. The ink was slightly tacky, the images sharp and undeniable. I walked to the front door and took one last look. The silence was absolute. I felt a strange, detached sense of accomplishment. The betrayal was the catalyst, but the response was the masterpiece. I hadn't raised a hand. I hadn't uttered a single syllable of anger. I had simply applied the laws of physics to a failing emotional economy. I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door. I didn't lock it. There was nothing left inside that I cared to protect. I walked to my car, my boots clicking on the wet pavement. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold steel of a heavy industrial bolt, a souvenir from a project that had stood the test of time. I gripped it tightly, a physical anchor in a world that had gone adrift. I started the engine and looked at the darkened windows of the bedroom. Nola would be back in a few hours. She would expect to find me asleep, or perhaps brooding in my office. She would expect the same Rhett Vossin she had spent years manipulating, the man who valued stability above all else. She was about to learn that when a civil engineer realizes a structure is condemned, he doesn't try to patch the cracks. He clears the site. I put the car in gear and drove away into the gray haze of the approaching dawn. I had a temporary space set up across town, a place where the Wi-Fi was fast and the neighbors were strangers. The first phase was complete. The evidence was gathered, the assets were secured, and the silence was established. As I drove, I allowed myself a small, grim smile. Nola and Monroe thought they were playing a game of secrets. They didn't realize that I had spent my entire career studying how things break, and I had just found the primary stress point. The temporary apartment was a minimalist glass box overlooking a commercial district that never quite slept. It smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and transition. I sat at a small folding table, the glow from 3 different monitors washing over my face in a rhythmic cycle of blue and white light. On the far wall, a digital clock blinked 4:48 a.m. In my old life, the one that had expired roughly 6 hours ago, I would be turning over in bed, perhaps listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of a woman who was currently occupying a very different set of sheets. I didn't feel the need for sleep. Fatigue is for people who have unresolved questions. I had nothing but answers and a very specific sequence of operations to perform. I pulled up the internal server for Vero PR. Nola's assistant, a bright-eyed 24-year-old named Chloe, was meticulous about her digital filing, a trait I usually admired and one I was currently exploiting. Chloe's password had been Nola #1 for 3 years. It was almost insulting how little effort people put into their own security while they were busy dismantling the security of others. I spent the next hour mapping the gossip chain. Nola wasn't just having an affair. She was using Monroe's investment connections to pad her firm's portfolio, funneling kickbacks through a series of consulting fees. It was a delicate web of professional impropriety that relied entirely on the discretion of people who were inherently indiscreet. I began to download the ledgers, the email threads, and the calendar invites for late-night strategy sessions that coincided perfectly with Monroe's travel schedule. Around 6:15 a.m., I checked the remote feed from the smart doorbell at the house. A silver coupe pulled into the driveway. The resolution was high enough that I could see the exhaust curling in the chilly morning air. Nola stepped out. She looked slightly disheveled, her evening dress covered by a trench coat, her heels clicking with a hesitant rhythm on the concrete. She paused at the front door, likely bracing herself for a lie she had rehearsed on the drive home. I watched her enter. I watched the foyer light blink on. I imagined the silence hitting her, the specific, heavy silence of a house that had been purged of a human presence. There is a particular resonance to an empty room. The acoustics change when the furniture, the rugs, and the personal clutter are removed. It becomes an echo chamber for one's own conscience. I saw her hand go to the light switch, then stay there. She walked toward the kitchen island. I could see the back of her head on the wide-angle lens of the kitchen camera, the one she'd insisted we install to monitor the gourmet pantry. She stopped. I knew exactly what she was looking at. The silver key and the stack of high-resolution photographs. She didn't move for 3 minutes. Then her shoulders slumped. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the photos. She didn't pick them up. She didn't have to. The evidence was as structural as a load-bearing wall, and she was watching the roof cave in. She turned toward the hallway, likely heading for my office. She would find the drawers empty. She would find the safe open and hollow. She would find that every trace of Rhett Vossin, from my collection of vintage transit maps to my spare fountain pens, had vanished. I closed the laptop. The first phase of psychological displacement was complete. I left the apartment and walked down to the local cafe. It was a sterile, high-traffic spot where the baristas didn't recognize names. I ordered a black coffee and sat in a corner booth with a view of the street. I needed to move my car. My sedan was a reliable machine, but it was recognizable. I had already arranged for a long-term rental, a nondescript gray SUV, under a corporate account. As I sipped the bitter coffee, I pulled out my tablet. I had a message from Evan, my younger brother. Evan worked in commercial real estate and had been the one to introduce Monroe to our social circle. He was a good man, but he was susceptible to the golden boy aura Monroe projected. "Hey, Rhett. Monroe mentioned he's putting together a private equity group for that new waterfront development. Said you might want in on the engineering side. Give him a call?" I stared at the message. The irony was a physical weight. Monroe wasn't just taking my wife. He was trying to use my professional reputation to anchor his latest financial scheme. He wanted my stamp of approval on a project that would likely be as hollow as his own character. I replied with a single sentence. "I'm busy with a structural failure right now, Evan. I'll talk to you soon." I finished the coffee and headed back toward the residential area. I had to be careful. Monroe's office was only 6 blocks from my current location, and Nola's PR firm was another 4. This part of the city was a small pond, and I was a shark moving through the reeds. I reached the parking garage where I'd left my sedan. As I approached the vehicle, I noticed a man lingering near the exit. It was Mr. Henderson, a neighbor from 3 doors down, a man whose primary hobby was monitoring the neighborhood's trash pickup schedule. He was a talker, a human sponge for local trivia. "Rhett, that you?" he called out, squinting through his thick glasses. "Saw you leaving pretty early this morning. Or late last night, I guess. Everything okay at the house? Saw a big white van there around midnight." "Just some upgrades, Arthur," I said, my voice smooth and practiced. "Moving some equipment to the new site. You know how it is. Projects don't build themselves." Right. Meticulous as always," he chuckled, leaning against a concrete pillar. "Say, I saw Nola's car come in just a bit ago. She looked like she was in a hurry, almost clipped the mailbox." "Big launch today," I said, opening my car door. "High stakes. You have a good one, Arthur." I backed out of the space, my eyes scanning the mirrors. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a sharp, cold focus. That was a close call. In a revenge plot, as in engineering, the most dangerous variables are the ones you can't calculate, like a retired neighbor with insomnia. I needed to be more nomadic. I drove the sedan to a long-term lot near the airport, swapped it for the gray SUV, and doubled back into the city. By noon, I was parked outside Vero PR. From my vantage point, I could see the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite. Nola was there. She was pacing. Even from this distance, her body language screamed agitation. She was on the phone, her free hand gesturing wildly. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know she was calling Monroe. I also knew he wasn't answering. Monroe was currently in a high-level meeting with the City Planning Commission, a meeting I had facilitated by sending over a preliminary structural report that raised several urgent questions about his waterfront site. I pulled up the firm's social media manager. It was a dashboard that controlled the public image of a dozen high-profile clients. Nola prided herself on being the architect of reputation. It was time to show her how easily an architect could become a demolition expert. I didn't upload the photos, not yet. That would be too quick, too merciful. Instead, I began to leak small, unverifiable rumors to the local business blogs, anonymous tips about financial inconsistencies and improper associations within the firm. I used a VPN and a series of encrypted proxies. By 2 p.m., the first whispers were appearing in the comments sections of the city's most influential trade journals. Internal commentary ran through my head like a ticker tape. Structure compromised, support beams failing, initial cracks appearing in the facade. I drove to a local park and sat on a bench, watching a group of pigeons fight over a discarded crust of bread. The banality of the world continued around me, oblivious to the fact that I was systematically dismantling 2 lives. I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of forgiveness, but the peace of a job well done. My phone buzzed. It was Nola. She had tried calling me 14 times in the last hour. Now she sent a text. "Rhett, please. Where are you? What is this? We need to talk. I'm at the house and everything is gone. Why is everything gone?" I didn't reply. Silence is the most effective psychological weapon. It forces the recipient to fill the void with their own worst fears. I watched the bubbles on the screen as she started to type another message, then stopped, then started again. I shifted my focus to Monroe. I sent an email to his corporate address from a burner account. The subject line was simply, "The Waterfront Project." Inside the email was a single attachment, a PDF of the hotel receipt from last night, side by side with a copy of his company's ethics policy regarding conflicts of interest and personal conduct during business hours. I didn't include a message. I didn't need to. The implication was a bridge that built itself. The afternoon sun began to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the grass. I looked at the time. It was time for the final touch of the day. I drove back toward our neighborhood, but I didn't go to our house. I went to the small parquet at the entrance of the subdivision. I pulled out a heavy-duty stapler and a stack of posters I'd printed earlier. They weren't posters of the affair. They were found posters. Found. A sense of integrity. If you lost yours between the Heights Hotel and the downtown district, please contact Monroe Drevan or Nola Vero. They seem to have misplaced theirs as well. I hung them on the community board, on the light poles, and near the mailbox clusters. It was petty, yes. It was small. But in the world of suburban reputations, a small crack is often the beginning of a total collapse. I got back into the SUV and drove to a high point overlooking the valley where our house sat. Through a pair of binoculars, I saw Nola come out onto the front porch. She was holding her phone to her ear, looking up and down the street. She looked small. She looked fragile. She looked like a woman who had realized that the man she thought was a harmless, predictable civil engineer was actually the one holding the remote detonator. I put the binoculars away and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced at the digital dashboard. I had deleted our shared calendar. I had closed our joint accounts. I had rerouted my paycheck to a private bank. I had already won without saying a word. The house was empty. Her secrets were moving from the shadows into the light, and I was just getting started on the physical reminders of her betrayal. The temporary workspace I had established was a masterpiece of cold, digital efficiency. I sat in the center of a web of fiber optic cables and glowing monitors, watching the city wake up through a polarized window. Today was the day the internal rot of Vero PR and Drevan Holdings became a public concern. I adjusted my glasses and sipped a cup of lukewarm tea. My mind felt like a finely tuned engine, every gear engaging with the precision of a Swiss watch. I wasn't just a man seeking redress. I was a system auditor removing a faulty component from the social machine. I began by opening the local business wire. Nola's firm was scheduled to host a high-profile media breakfast at 9 a.m. for a sustainable energy client. It was the kind of event she lived for, all polished marble, expensive catering, and carefully curated narratives. I looked at the guest list I had intercepted from Chloe's cloud storage. It was a roster of the city's most influential journalists and investors. Perfect. I had already prepared a digital package for every person on that list. At precisely 8:45 a.m., I hit send on a scheduled mass email. The subject line was Supplementary Project Data, Vero and Drevan. Inside wasn't a press release. It was a concise, annotated timeline of the consulting fees Monroe had been paying Nola, cross-referenced with the dates of the municipal contracts Monroe had secured. It looked like a professional audit. To the trained eye of a business reporter, it looked like a scandal. I didn't mention the betrayal of our marriage. That was too personal, too messy. I focused on the professional impropriety. In this city, a broken heart is a gossip item, but a broken ledger is a career-ending event. I watched the live social media feed for the event. For the first 20 minutes, it was business as usual. Photos of croissants, gleaming tech displays, and Nola looking radiant in a navy blue suit. Then, the rhythm changed. I saw several journalists looking at their phones simultaneously. A murmur seemed to ripple through the digital noise. The likes stopped. The questions in the comments section shifted from the Energy Project to unverified reports of financial misconduct. I saw a grainy photo of Nola at the podium, her expression shifting from a practiced smile to a mask of confusion as she realized the room was no longer under her control. I turned my attention to Monroe. He was more of a physical problem than Nola. Monroe operated on bravado and the assumption that he could outrun his own shadow. I knew he parked his silver coupe in a reserved spot behind the Drevan Holdings building every morning at 10 a.m. I drove my rental SUV to the alleyway adjacent to his lot, keeping the engine idling. I watched him pull in. He looked frantic, his phone pressed to his ear, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The Metropolitan News had likely just reached out for a comment. I waited until he stepped out of the car. I didn't approach him. Instead, I drove the SUV forward just enough to block his exit path. Then I rolled down the window. The rain had started again, a fine mist that turned the pavement into a mirror. Monroe froze, his eyes widening as he recognized me. I didn't say anything. I simply held up a manila envelope. Inside were the original hotel receipts, the ones I had scanned earlier. I let him see the logo of the Heights Hotel before I pulled it back. "Rhett!" he shouted, his voice cracking against the brick walls of the alley. "Rhett, wait, let's be reasonable. This is all a misunderstanding. We can fix this. Think about the waterfront project." I didn't blink. I reached out and slowly, deliberately folded the envelope and put it in the glove box. I put the SUV in reverse and backed away, leaving him standing in the rain. I didn't need to speak to him. The sight of me, calm and silent, was a far greater threat than any physical altercation. I was the ghost in his machine, the variable he couldn't account for. As I drove away, I began the second phase of the morning's operations. I had gained access to Monroe's office building's digital directory the night before. Using a remote override, I changed the display in the lobby. Instead of Drevan Holdings, Suite 400, the screen now flashed Accountability, Room 404, Not Found. It was a subtle, engineering-themed joke that only I would truly appreciate, but it added to the general atmosphere of technological collapse that was beginning to surround him. I headed back to my safe house, my mind already pivoting to the next task. I needed to ensure that Evan, my brother, was insulated from the fallout. I called him. "Evan, I need you to pull your name from the waterfront development, today, within the hour." "Rhett, what's going on?" "The news is saying Nola's firm is under investigation. Monroe is blowing up my phone." "Don't answer him, Evan. The structure is compromised. If you stay on that bridge, you're going down with it. Trust me. Check your personal email in 5 minutes. I sent him the proof. The real proof. Not the financial records I'd sent to the press, but the personal messages. I watched my sent folder, counting the seconds. When the phone rang again, Evan's voice was different. The upbeat younger brother tone was gone, replaced by a hollow, somber resonance. I'm out, Rhett. I'm sending the resignation now. I had no idea. He told me. He said everything was fine." "Everything will be fine for you, Evan. Just step back." I felt a twinge of something, not guilt, but a recognition of the collateral damage. But as I had learned in the field, sometimes you have to divert the river to save the town. Evan was safe. Monroe and Nola, however, were still in the flood zone. I spent the afternoon monitoring the fallout. Nola's boss, a hard-edged woman named Regina who valued the firm's reputation above all else, had released a statement. Vero Pierre was reviewing the status of its senior partners. In PR speak, that meant Nola was being erased from the letterhead. I watched a live stream from a news van parked outside their office. Nola was seen leaving through a side exit, her face shielded by a large designer handbag. The irony was palpable. The woman who managed the public's perception of reality could no longer face the public herself. I decided it was time for a more direct, physical reminder of the betrayal. I drove to the gym where Monroe spent his afternoons, a high-end facility where he went to admire his own reflection. I knew the layout perfectly. I had helped design the HVAC system for the building 5 years ago. I used my master key to enter the service corridor. I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted to humiliate him in the place where he felt most powerful. I found his locker. It was a digital lock system, easily bypassed with a universal reset code I'd kept in my files. I didn't steal his clothes or his wallet. Instead, I took his designer suit and replaced it with a bright orange jumpsuit I'd picked up at a construction supply store. I left a note pinned to the chest. A more appropriate uniform for a man of your integrity. I also took his car keys. I didn't steal the car, I simply moved it. I drove the silver coupe 3 blocks away and parked it in a tow zone. Then I dropped the keys down a storm drain near the gym entrance. The physicality of the act was satisfying. It wasn't violence, it was a rearrangement of his reality. It was a disruption of the smooth, frictionless life he thought he deserved. As I sat in my SUV across from the gym, waiting for him to emerge, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. I know what you're doing, Rhett. You're not the only one who knows how to play with data. Monroe has friends. You should be careful where you park. I felt a sudden, sharp prickle of awareness. I looked in my rearview mirror. A black sedan was idling at the end of the block. It hadn't moved in 10 minutes. I checked my GPS tracker. I had installed one on my own rental as a precaution, and there was another signal overlapping mine, a secondary tracker. Monroe had an ally, someone I hadn't accounted for. My mind raced through the possibilities. It wasn't Evan. It wasn't any of our mutual friends. It had to be someone internal to Drevan Holdings, someone who had a vested interest in the waterfront project. I didn't panic. I put the SUV in gear and eased out into traffic. I didn't head back to the safe house. I headed toward the dense, narrow streets of the old garment district. If someone was tracking me, I needed to lead them into a maze where their technology would be useless against my knowledge of the city's layout. The chase was subtle. The black sedan followed at a discreet distance, mirroring my turns but never drawing level. I led them through a series of one-way alleys and underground passages that were technically closed for construction. I knew which gates were unlocked and which sensors were inactive. I was the architect of this environment. They were merely visitors. I pulled into a multi-level parking structure that was half demolished. I drove to the 3rd floor, parked behind a concrete pillar, and waited. The black sedan entered a minute later, its headlights sweeping the dark, dusty space. I watched from the shadows as the car slowed. The driver was cautious, sensing a trap. I reached for my laptop and engaged the building's emergency alarm system. The strobe lights began to flash, and a deafening siren echoed through the concrete cavern. The driver of the black sedan flinched, the car jerking forward as they lost their composure. In the chaos of the flashing lights, I slipped out of the parking structure through a pedestrian exit and doubled back to the street where I had parked a secondary vehicle, a nondescript bicycle I'd stashed for just such an occasion. I pedaled away, the cold rain soaking through my jacket, but I felt a surge of exhilaration. I was one step ahead. I had identified a new variable, and now I could begin to neutralize it. I arrived back at a new temporary location, a motel on the outskirts of the city. I sat on the edge of the bed, the neon sign from the parking lot flickering through the thin curtains. I pulled up Nola's social media one last time before I closed the day's files. She had deleted her accounts. The silence was final. I looked at the note I had written to myself at the beginning of the week. Revenge is not a moment. It is a process of structural redistribution. The public humiliation was complete. The personal payback was underway. But the revelation of Monroe's ally had changed the game. It was no longer a simple demolition. It was a siege. I lay back on the thin pillow, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. I had enough evidence to sink them both 10 times over, but I needed to be careful. The next phase would require more than just digital leaks and missing suits. It would require a direct confrontation with the ruins of the life I had built. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I was busy designing the final reveal, the one that would leave Monroe and Nola with nothing but the echoes of their own betrayal. The motel room smelled of stale ozone and industrial-grade lavender, a scent that clung to the back of my throat like a persistent secret. I sat at the small, scarred desk, my laptop humming as it processed the data I'd scraped from the black sedan's registration. The ally wasn't a corporate lackey or a hired hand. It was Julian Vero, Nola's cousin and a senior analyst at the city's zoning office. The symmetry of it was almost poetic. While I was calculating the load-bearing capacity of bridges, Julian was manipulating the very ground they sat on. He was the one facilitating Monroe's land grabs, ensuring that the structural failures I'd flagged would be buried under a mountain of bureaucratic paperwork. I leaned back, my neck popping with a sound like a dry twig. The game had expanded. This wasn't just about a broken marriage anymore. It was about an entire ecosystem of corruption, that used my professional integrity as its camouflage. Sarcasm bubbled up in my chest, a dry, bitter amusement at the thought that they considered me the predictable one. To them, I was the man who followed the manual. They forgot that the man who writes the manual knows exactly which pages can be torn out without the whole book falling apart. I began the physical phase of the retribution at 4:00 a.m. I drove the SUV back into our neighborhood, parking 3 blocks away in a shadow that felt as deep as a trench. I walked to the house, my movements fluid and silent. I didn't use the front door this time. I went through the crawl space entrance I'd reinforced 2 years ago. I moved through the vents and the utility corridors, a ghost in my own walls. Nola was there. I could hear her in the kitchen, the clink of a glass against the granite, the heavy, ragged sound of someone who had discovered that their gilded life was made of pyrite. I didn't feel a surge of pity. I felt the same detached observation I'd feel looking at a crumbling embankment. The erosion was too far gone for a simple fix. I reached the central hub of the house's smart system. I didn't shut it off. That would be too obvious. Instead, I reconfigured the logic. I set the lighting to a subterranean dimness that would cycle every few minutes, enough to keep her on edge without being an outright malfunction. I adjusted the thermostat to a persistent, chilly 55 degrees. Most importantly, I began to upload the audio files I'd captured from Monroe's office, the recordings of him bragging about how he was using Nola's firm as a disposable shield. I set them to play at a near inaudible volume through the recessed ceiling speakers, a whisper that would sound like the house itself was gossiping about her. By the time I slipped back out, the first hints of dawn were bleaching the sky. I had a different destination now, Julian's residence. Julian lived in a high-rise downtown, a glass tower that prided itself on its unbeatable security. As I approached the building, I saw the black sedan parked in the loading zone. Julian was inside, likely coordinating with Monroe on how to silence the disgruntled engineer. I parked across the street and opened my tablet. Julian's weakness was his reliance on a smart home ecosystem that was as arrogant as he was. I didn't hack his accounts. I simply spoofed the maintenance signal from the building's elevator bank. I watched through the glass lobby doors. Within 10 minutes, the service elevator began a phantom cycle, stopping on Julian's floor and holding the doors open, triggering a series of alarms that echoed through the marble lobby. The security guard, a man whose primary qualification seemed to be his ability to look bored, scrambled to the control panel. In the confusion, I walked through the side entrance, a door I knew stayed unlatched for 3 minutes during the morning trash collection. I didn't go to Julian's apartment. I went to the basement. I found the main water manifold for the building's east wing. Using a heavy-duty pipe wrench, I didn't break anything. I simply tightened the pressure regulators to their maximum capacity. Within an hour, the pipes in Julian's suite would begin to groan and shudder with a sound like a submarine at the bottom of the ocean. It was a physical manifestation of the pressure I was applying to his life. Next, I went to Monroe's private office. Not the corporate headquarters where the media was currently camped out, but the think tank he kept in a converted warehouse by the river. This was where he kept the real ledgers, the ones that Julian helped him sanitize. I arrived to find Monroe's silver coupe parked haphazardly on the sidewalk. He was inside, the lights blazing. I could see him through the window, his silhouette pacing back and forth, a phone glued to his ear. He looked smaller than he had 48 hours ago. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a frantic, cornered man. I didn't enter the building. I went to the external power transformer. I pulled a small, handheld frequency jammer from my bag, a device used for testing interference on bridge sensors. I tuned it to the specific range of his high-speed router. One click, and his digital lifeline was severed. I watched through the window as he froze, staring at his computer screen, then began to shake his phone in a futile gesture of technological frustration. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I walked to the window and tapped on the glass. Monroe spun around. When he saw me, he didn't move. He looked like a man watching a landslide approach his front door. I didn't shout. I didn't gesture. I simply held up a small physical item. The gold cufflinks Nola had given him for Christmas. I'd found them in the emergency bag he kept in his locker. I let them catch the light, then I dropped them into the muddy puddle at my feet. He lunged for the door, but I was already moving. I ran toward the alleyway, my boots splashing through the rainwater. Monroe was surprisingly fast, fueled by a desperation that was almost tangible. He chased me through the narrow corridor of brick and rusted iron, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Rhett, stop! You're ruining everything. I'll pay you. I'll give you whatever you want." I led him toward the loading dock of a neighboring furniture warehouse. I knew the schedule. The morning delivery was due any second. As I reached the edge of the dock, I vaulted over a stack of wooden pallets and disappeared into the shadows of a parked trailer. Monroe followed, stumbling over the debris, his expensive shoes slick with mud. Just as he reached the center of the dock, a heavy freight truck backed into the bay, its backup alarm a piercing, rhythmic scream. The driver, unable to see Monroe in the blind spot, continued the maneuver. Monroe was trapped between the moving wall of the truck and the locked warehouse door. He flattened himself against the brick, his face pale, his hands trembling as the massive vehicle hissed to a stop inches from his chest. I stood on the far side of the trailer, watching him. He was pinned, not by force, but by the sheer weight of his own poor choices. He looked at me, pleading, but I stayed silent. I turned and walked away, the sound of the truck's air brakes echoing like a final judgment. I returned to my SUV and checked my phone. Nola had sent a final text. "The house is screaming, Rhett. I can't stay here. I'm leaving." I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. The displacement was nearly total. They were no longer the masters of their environments. They were refugees in a world they had tried to manipulate. I drove back toward the city center, the rain finally stopping and giving way to a gray, oppressive overcast. I stopped at a public library and used one of their terminals to send a final email. This one went to the city's ethics committee, with Julian Vero CC'd. It contained the exact GPS coordinates of every site Julian had cleared for Monroe, along with the timestamps of the private meetings they'd held at the Heights Hotel. I didn't include a note. The data was the message. As I walked back to my car, I saw a news report on a television in a shop window. Drevan Holdings assets frozen amidst growing investigation. There was a photo of Monroe, looking disheveled and frantic, being ushered into a car by his legal team. I sat in the SUV and looked at my hands. They were steady. My heart rate was a calm, resting 80 beats per minute. I was an engineer, and the demolition was proceeding exactly according to the blueprint. But there was one final layer to the retribution, one that required me to step out of the shadows and look them both in the eye. The mysterious ally, Julian, was likely currently dealing with a flooded apartment and a career in freefall. Monroe was trapped in a legal and financial vice, and Nola was realizing that the man she had dismissed as a boring, predictable technician was the only person who truly understood the cost of a structural failure. I put the car in gear. I had one more stop to make, the downtown PR event where Nola's former firm was holding an emergency press conference. It was time for the grand reveal, the moment where the private betrayal and the public scandal intersected in a way that could never be repaired. I looked at the silver bolt in my cup holder. It was a reminder that some things are built to last, and some things are built to be broken. Today, I was the one deciding which was which. The downtown skyline was a jagged silhouette of steel and glass, shimmering under the residual moisture of the morning rain. I stood on the sidewalk outside the Grand Meridian Hotel, adjusting the lapels of a suit I hadn't worn since our last anniversary. It felt like a costume, a physical tether to a man I no longer recognized. Inside the ballroom, Vero PR was attempting a desperate exercise in damage control, a Future of Integrity gala designed to distance the firm from the growing stains on Nola's reputation. They were inviting the very investors Monroe had been courting, a final attempt to stabilize the structure before the foundation gave way entirely. I walked through the revolving doors, the conditioned air hitting me with a sterile, synthetic chill. The lobby was a hive of activity, journalists with cameras, PR consultants whispering into headsets, and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels on polished marble. I moved with a practiced anonymity. To the security staff, I was just another middle-aged professional in a gray suit. They didn't see the engineer, they saw a guest. The ballroom was a cavern of opulence, lit by crystal chandeliers that cast a hard, uncompromising light over the crowd. At the far end of the room, a massive digital screen displayed a rotating loop of corporate logos and aspirational slogans about building the future. Nola was there, standing near the stage. She was wearing a dress the color of a bruised plum, her hair pinned back in a way that emphasized the newfound hollowness of her cheeks. She was holding a champagne glass, but she wasn't drinking. She was scanning the room with the frantic intensity of a sailor looking for a lighthouse in a storm. I took a position near the AV booth, a recessed area filled with cables and control panels. The technicians were busy adjusting audio levels, their eyes fixed on the stage. I leaned against a marble pillar, my hand in my pocket, gripping a thumb drive. This was the final load-bearing beam. If I pulled this, the entire ceiling would come down. I waited for the moment when Regina, the head of the firm, stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent, the kind of heavy, expectant quiet that precedes a controlled demolition. "Ladies and gentlemen," Regina began, her voice amplified to a commanding resonance, "we are here today to discuss the resilience of our city and the unwavering commitment of Vero PR to the highest standards of professional conduct." As she spoke, I moved. I didn't rush. I walked to the side of the AV booth and tapped the lead technician on the shoulder. I held up a lanyard I'd acquired from the hotel's maintenance office earlier that morning. Firm sent over an updated reel for the highlight loop, I whispered, my voice flat and authoritative. The municipal data needs to be integrated before the keynote. The technician, overwhelmed by the chaos of the event, didn't question me. He took the drive and plugged it into the main server. I watched as the progress bar climbed, a blue line of inevitability moving toward 100%. Regina continued her speech, her words a polished veneer of corporate jargon. We believe in transparency. We believe in the future of the waterfront development as a beacon of progress. The screen behind her flickered. The corporate logos vanished, replaced by a high-resolution image of the Heights Hotel receipt. Then, a recording began to play, not over the speakers, but as a series of large-format text transcripts that scrolled across the screen in silence. It was the transcript of the messages between Nola and Monroe, the ones where they discussed how to reallocate the engineering fees from my projects to fund their own private ventures. The silence in the room shifted from expectant to suffocating. I saw Nola's glass slip from her hand. It didn't shatter. It landed on the thick carpet with a dull, muffled thud, the champagne spreading like a pale, translucent stain. She looked at the screen, her mouth opening but no sound emerging. Then the images changed. They were the photos I had taken of them in the rain, the grainy, undeniable proof of a betrayal that was both personal and professional. The crowd began to murmur, a low, rising hum of realization. Journalists began to lift their cameras, the flashes of light strobing against the walls like a digital thunderstorm. Regina turned, her face a mask of horror as she saw the content on the screen. She tried to signal the AV booth, but I had already engaged the lockout protocol from my tablet. The screen was frozen on a photo of Monroe and Nola, their faces illuminated by a street lamp, their guilt framed in a high-definition landscape. "Shut it down," Regina hissed, but it was too late. The feed had already been mirrored to the city's largest news blogs via the firm's own high-speed Wi-Fi. I walked toward the center of the room, cutting through the throng of stunned investors. I stopped 10 feet from Nola. She saw me then. Her eyes widened, the recognition hitting her with a physical force that made her stumble back against the stage. "Rhett," she whispered, the word barely audible over the growing noise of the crowd. I didn't say a word. I simply looked at her, not with anger, but with the detached, clinical gaze of a man inspecting a failed weld. I stayed there for exactly 5 seconds, ensuring she saw the lack of emotion in my eyes. Then I turned my attention to the entrance of the ballroom. Monroe had just entered. He had clearly heard about the gala and had come to try and save his own interests. He was flanked by Julian Vero, who looked like a man who had spent the last 3 hours trying to outrun a flood. When Monroe saw the screen, he stopped in his tracks. His face went from a frantic red to a pale, ghostly white. The crowd turned toward him. The investors he had spent months courting began to pull away, creating a physical void around him as if he were radioactive. The journalists descended, their microphones extended like spears. "Mr. Drevan, can you comment on the allegations of financial fraud? Is it true you used Vero PR to manipulate zoning laws?" Monroe tried to push through, but his path was blocked by a wall of cameras. He looked around for an exit, but the room had become a labyrinth of his own making. Julian, seeing the direction of the wind, stepped away from his cousin's husband, trying to blend into the crowd, but his face was already on the screen, listed as a key facilitator in the scrolling text. I moved through the chaos toward the exit. The physicality of the scene was intense, the heat of the lights, the press of bodies, the electric tension of a public shaming. I felt a strange, humming energy in my limbs, a sense of lightness that I hadn't felt in years. The structure had collapsed, and I was the only one who knew the way out of the ruins. As I reached the lobby, I saw a black sedan pull up to the curb. It wasn't Julian's, it was a municipal vehicle. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, the city's Integrity Commission. They walked past me, their expressions grim and focused. They were heading for the ballroom. They were heading for Monroe and Julian. I walked out into the afternoon air. The overcast sky had broken, and a few rays of sunlight were reflecting off the glass towers. I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. It was a message from Liam. "I just saw the news, Rhett. My God, are you okay? Where are you?" I didn't reply. I wasn't the man Liam knew anymore. I was a man who had seen the inner workings of his life and found them wanting. I walked toward the parking garage, my steps steady and rhythmic. I was almost to my SUV when I heard a voice behind me. "You think you've won, don't you?" It was Julian. He had followed me out, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and desperation. He was breathing hard, his expensive tie loosened and askew. "You ruined everything, Vossin," he spat, stepping closer. "That waterfront project was going to revitalize the whole district. We were making things happen. You're just a small-minded technician who can't see the big picture." I stopped and turned to face him. I didn't feel a need to defend myself. I looked at the way his jaw was clenched, the way his hands were balled into fists. He was a man of words and influence. He didn't know how to handle a man of facts and figures. "The big picture is built on small details, Julian," I said, my voice low and calm. "If the details are corrupt, the big picture is just a lie. I didn't ruin your project. I just revealed that it was never going to stand." He lunged forward, not to strike me, but to grab the tablet I was holding. I stepped to the side with a fluid, calculated movement, letting his momentum carry him past me. He stumbled, his shoulder hitting a concrete pillar. He spun around, looking for a way to regain his dignity, but he was alone in a parking garage with the man who had just dismantled his career. "The commission is inside, Julian," I said. "I'd suggest you find a very good lawyer. Though based on the ledgers I sent them, I don't think any amount of legal maneuvering is going to fix this structural failure." I got into my SUV and started the engine. I watched in the rearview mirror as Julian stood there, a small, defeated figure against the backdrop of the city he had tried to own. As I drove away, I felt a final, echoing sense of closure. The public spectacle was over. The grand reveal had been executed with a precision that would have made my old professors proud. But there was still one final act, the personal, symbolic conclusion to the story of Rhett and Nola. I drove toward the river, toward the old bridge that I had designed years ago. It was a structure I knew was sound, a piece of work I could actually be proud of. I needed to stand somewhere that wasn't built on a lie. The city was a grid of lights and shadows, a complex system that I had successfully navigated. I felt a sarcastic laugh bubble up in my chest. Nola had always said I was too focused on the blueprints. She never realized that the blueprints are the only things that tell the truth. The river was a vein of liquid lead under the bruised purple of the twilight sky. I stood on the pedestrian walkway of the Vossin Bridge, the suspension cables humming in the wind like the strings of a massive, somber instrument. This bridge was my first major solo project. I had calculated every tension point, every thermal expansion joint, and every vibration dampener with a devotion that bordered on the religious. It was a structure built to endure the elements, the traffic, and the passage of decades. It was the antithesis of the life I had shared with Nola, a life that had folded like a house of cards at the first sign of a real gale. I leaned against the cold steel railing, my hands buried in my pockets. The city lights were beginning to flicker on, a million pinpricks of light trying to ward off the encroaching dark. Down in the valley, I could see the silhouette of our former home. From this distance, it looked peaceful, a domestic sanctuary in a quiet neighborhood. But I knew the reality. The interior was a hollowed-out shell, the air thick with the echoes of recorded whispers and the chill of a sabotaged climate control system. My phone vibrated. I didn't have to look to know who it was. The notification light blinked a steady, rhythmic blue. I pulled it out and saw the final flurry of messages from Monroe. He was no longer threatening. He was bargaining. He was offering me a percentage of his remaining offshore holdings if I would provide a corrected statement to the commission regarding the waterfront ledgers. It was a pathetic, predictable move. He was a man who believed that everything, including truth and gravity, had a price. I watched the message for a moment, then I did something I should have done months ago. I selected his contact and hit delete. Then I did the same for Nola. Their names vanished from my digital existence, leaving only a clean, empty list. I felt a slight, sarcastic tilt to my lips. It was a simple subtraction, but the resulting clarity was immense. I walked back to my SUV and pulled out a small, heavy box. It contained the last of the physical artifacts. Inside were the keys to the house, the shared credit cards, all snapped in half with a pair of industrial shears, and a single framed photograph of the three of us at the Tuscany vineyard. I walked to the center of the bridge, the highest point above the churning water. One by one, I dropped the items. The keys fell with a sharp, metallic whistle. The plastic shards of the cards fluttered like mechanical insects. Finally, I held the photo. I looked at the smiling faces, the false warmth of the sunlight on the grapevines, the staged intimacy of a friendship that was nothing more than a predatory alliance. I let go. The frame caught the wind, spinning once, twice, before the dark water swallowed it whole. There was no splash, just a quiet integration into the flow. I wasn't finished. The final layer of revenge required a more tangible conclusion. I drove to Monroe's secondary property, the warehouse by the river where he had tried to corner me earlier. The silver coupe was still parked there, abandoned by the side of the road because the keys were currently resting at the bottom of a storm drain. I parked the SUV and walked toward the car. I didn't use a crowbar or a brick. I used a pressurized canister of industrial-grade expanding foam. I inserted the nozzle into the exhaust pipe, the door seams, and the air intakes. I squeezed the trigger. listening to the soft, rhythmic hiss as the chemical expanded, filling the internal cavities of the machine and hardening into a rigid, immovable mass. It was a nonviolent, perfectly silent form of sabotage. The car looked exactly the same from the outside, but it was now a 3,000-pound paperweight. It would never move again. It was a monument to stagnation. I moved on to the warehouse itself. I didn't need to enter. I went to the external junction box for the sprinkler system. I didn't trigger the water. I simply reprogrammed the diagnostic cycle to run every 30 minutes. Throughout the night, the internal sensors would trip, the alarms would chirp, and the system would perform a loud, clanking reset. Monroe would spend his remaining nights of freedom in a state of perpetual, noisy interruption. I returned to the SUV and drove toward the downtown district. I had one final delivery to make. I pulled up to the curb in front of the city's largest newspaper office. I stepped out and handed a thick, sealed envelope to the night courier at the desk. For the lead investigative reporter, I said, "It's the final structural report on the waterfront project." The envelope didn't just contain financial records. It contained the blueprints with my own red pen annotations, showing exactly where Monroe and Julian had skimped on the reinforcement steel and the concrete grade to pad their own pockets. It was the smoking gun, rendered in the precise language of civil engineering. It was the final nail in the coffin of their professional lives. As I walked back to the car, I saw a figure standing near the entrance of a late-night cafe. It was Nola. She was wearing a coat that looked too big for her arms wrapped around her middle as if she were trying to hold herself together. She saw me, and for a moment, we stood there in the quiet of the city street. She didn't run to me. She didn't scream. She just looked at me with a profound, shattered realization. She looked like someone who had just watched a bridge collapse and realized they were still standing on the wrong side of the chasm. "Rhett," she said, her voice thin and brittle. "What are you going to do now?" I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to provide an answer. I didn't feel the need to fix her problem or explain the logic of my actions. I was no longer the architect of her world. "I'm going to go for a drive, Nola," I said. "The roads are clear." I got into the SUV and pulled away from the curb. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I drove through the heart of the city, passing the glowing glass towers and the dark industrial blocks. I felt a sense of immense, unburdened space. The betrayal had been a seismic event, a total failure of the foundations I had trusted. But like any good engineer, I had cleared the debris. I had salvaged the useful components and discarded the rot. I reached the highway that led out of the city, heading toward the mountains. The road was a smooth black ribbon winding through the forest. The air coming through the vents was crisp and clean, free of the scent of stale lavender and expensive lies. I reached for the radio and turned it on. A slow, steady jazz melody filled the cabin, a complex arrangement of notes that found harmony in their own independence. I thought about the bridge I had stood on earlier. It would be there tomorrow. It would be there in 20 years. It was a piece of truth in a world of variables. I had built it to last, and in doing so, I had learned how to build myself. The sarcasm that had been my primary defense mechanism felt unnecessary now. I didn't need to be cynical to survive. I just needed to be precise. I looked at the dashboard clock. It was nearly midnight. A new day was beginning, a day that didn't belong to Nola or Monroe or the ruins of a suburban marriage. It belonged to the man behind the wheel. I accelerated, the engine humming with a steady, reliable power. The lights of the city faded in the distance, becoming a faint, glowing haze against the horizon. I was moving forward, not away. The structure was gone, the sight was clear, and the ground was finally stable. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up the silver bolt I had kept with me. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight and the strength of the cold steel. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I tossed it out the window. It disappeared into the dark, a small, forgotten detail in a vast open landscape. I didn't need a souvenir of the past. I had the blueprints for the future. The journey was long, and the destination was unknown, but the road was sound. I settled into the seat, my hands relaxed on the wheel, and drove into the quiet, starlit night. The revenge was complete, the payback was executed, and the silence was finally my own. I was Rhett Vossin, and I had survived the collapse.